Hebrews 11. And this will be, so we have arrived at the end of the list of the heroes of faith. So our author of Hebrews, he has listed numerous heroes of faith from the Old Testament to encourage us. And we have finally come to the end of that list. And after today's sermon, we'll be transitioning into a new section in Hebrews, and we'll be looking at Hebrews 12 starting next week. So this comes to, I hope that it comes to a satisfying conclusion to all the list of heroes that have gone before us, setting an example for us to follow in their footsteps, but also to be encouraged as Christians to continue to walk by faith. In our last sermon from Hebrews 11 will be by faith, dare. Okay, let's read from verses 32 verses 32 through 34. It's just a few verses, so let's read together if you may. And then after the first half, we'll read the rest of the verses together. Okay, Hebrews 11 verses 32 through 34. Let's read, ready, set, go. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David, and Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, and made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. This is the word of God. Thanks be to God. So I'm sure you've been keeping up with the war that is going on, right, in Europe, and it's been discouraging as it is getting prolonged for 3 weeks now. So the war has been going on for 3 weeks, and even though it doesn't directly threaten us in any way, we are still highly interested and we're still highly invested in it because it affects us indirectly. Right? It affects the markets, it affects the security, it affects the gas prices nonetheless. But it ought to concern us also because many are suffering as a result of it. So I'm sure you've been hearing, if not intentionally, but even though you don't want to, you hear about it very much and we're very much concerned. However, did you know that there's another battle, another war, that is constantly going on, even as we speak, here in this hour. A war that is invisible to our naked eyes, but it is a greater reality. This battle is about greater things than just land and resources that people fight for. And it is a spiritual battle. It is a spiritual battle that goes on incessantly, that Satan wages every minute for what? What is he fighting for? What is he waging war constantly for? It is for your hearts, for your minds, and for your souls. Peter writes in 1 Peter 5:8, it says, be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Right? This is the reality that we are not so concerned with, even though it is ongoing, constantly. It is going on even as we speak. And the purpose of this spiritual war is Satan is waging war against God and his forces to destroy your hearts and your minds. So it is our duty to guard our hearts, guard our minds, because it is out there and Satan is trying to take advantage. And the purpose is to do what? Devour. Devour and to destroy. Seek and destroy is his strategy. And also, the physical war that we see in the news and the spiritual war, they're not unrelated even. When you read through the Bible, the physical war ought to serve as a sign for the end times. As Jesus said, in the end times there will be constant wars between nations. And this is what he says in Matthew 24. Okay, so he talked about the end times, and the disciples had all kinds of questions. So this is what he said, verse 3 of 24, Matthew. As he sat down on Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" And Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am Christ,' and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place. But the end is not yet. For nations will rise against nations, and kingdoms against kingdoms, and there will be famines, earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains." Right? So Jesus is saying it is expected. All the wars that you hear about, make them as signs of the end times. Because in the end, there will be constant, incessant wars, nation against nations, kingdoms against kingdoms. This is but the beginning, says Jesus Christ. And then he goes on to say, in verse 9, he says, Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death. And you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because of lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. Then the end will come. Right? So we've been invested in the war. In the war in Europe. And did you know that they've been having wars all parts of the earth as well? But not only that, that physical war should serve as a sign to the spiritual battle that is going on constantly, even as we speak. Although they are invisible, that is the greater reality. And Jesus is reminding us to make those as signs for the spiritual battle. And in the end, not only there will be wars, Christians will be hated for your faith in me. Your love for me will grow cold because many will be persecuted. Many will leave, and many of you will turn against not only God, but against one another. And when you sit down and just listen to Jesus' warnings, don't Jesus' descriptions of the end times describe our time today? Right? The end is near. The war, we hear about war all the time. Not only of this war that is going on now, but even before then. Right? Wars in Africa, wars in all parts of the country. It's always there. And they will hate one another. And they will betray one another. And love for God will diminish. And people will fall away. And they will grow cold. And God says, this is just the beginning. How concerned are you with that spiritual battle that is going on? We're so invested in the physical war that is seen. But how concerned are you for the invisible war that is unseen? How concerned are you for your spiritual battle? Your battle against your sins. How invested are you in that? So the series Walk by Faith is about precisely this. Right? How to practically live as Christians in this world to glorify God. Right? Even though we're living in the physical world, we have to be concerned with the spiritual battle that is going on. And this book is telling us as people in this world how to live as Christians. How to walk by faith with our minds in the heavenly things. And how to do that practically is the purpose of this book. How should we prepare for the end times and live to glorify God in this life? So the author of Hebrews is writing this book to encourage the many persecuted Christians, especially the Hebrew Christians in this time, to glorify God in their lives, enduring the persecutions, to continue to live by faith and not become slaves of keeping the law or religious performance or achievements, but how to live by faith as people who are dedicated to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that is why he has given many heroes of faith for us to look back into, so that would empower us today, so that we will have enough power to live the future. That was the purpose of this chapter, Hebrews 11, Hall of Faith, some people call it. So we have come to this list. So we're concluding this section, and the author throws out a little bit more names as he is concluding. He's saying he's running out of time to mention everybody in the Old Testament. There's so many heroes that have gone before us who have all lived by faith, and time is limited. I can't mention every one of them, but here is just a few. So he throws out a few more names as he's concluding this section. So what are some of the names that he mentions? Hebrews 11 verse 32, he says, I don't have all the time to mention Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, and Samuel, and the prophets. But I want to spend a brief moment talking about these men, because all these stories are so fascinating. It is an awesome, awesome story to look into. But there's something unique about all this name, right? Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, all these people lived, some of them in the same time period, but some in different kingdoms and different eras. But there's one thing unique about all these people, and that is they were all people with major flaws. But God still used them for His glory because they believed. Because they had faith in God. So through this first set of people, we learned that by faith you must dare against the world by fighting. You must dare against the world by fighting. Instead of just sitting idle as a Christian, Jesus is for me and I have everything, I have the grace, and not doing anything about it, this list ought to encourage us. Despite of all our flaws, despite of all of our shortcomings as Christians, we still ought to live for the glory of God by daring against the world, putting up a fight. So let's look at Gideon. I'm not going to go through all the Old Testament passages, but Gideon, what do we know? Does anyone remember anything about Gideon, the judge? He's a great example of a man. Again, what was his major flaw? He had a major flaw. So, the judges. So he was one of the judges. So let me just give you a little bit of a background. So after Moses and Joshua brought the people of Israel into the promised land, now they were all settled, right? They have conquered all the land, and now they have settled. Now they're all living happily. But they didn't have a physical leader. They didn't have a king. Why? Because Israel was a theocracy. What does theocracy mean? They had God as their leader. God was their king. God was their leader. And yet people, if you read the book of Judges, the very first thing that you learn is that everybody did whatever was pleasing unto their own eyes. Because they had no physical leader, everybody did what was pleasing unto them. Right? They did whatever they wanted to do. And that is a perfect formula for judgment, disaster. Right? Because we're all sinful. If you all do whatever you want to do, in your own sinfulness, we will all head to destruction. And that's exactly what happened. And in their suffering, they would plead, Lord, I'm sorry, I want to repent. And then God sends a judge to judge the enemies and to deliver them from their enemies. And then they all live happily ever after. And then they turn to their own sinful ways again. They repeat that cynical cycle constantly. That's the story of the judges. And Gideon was one of the judges there. And God raised up Gideon because everybody around Israel was taking advantage of the weakness of Israel. Because they didn't have a physical leader. And they were so sinful. They were wicked. They were just turning to their own ways. So all kinds of neighboring countries took advantage. And during the time of Gideon, the Midianites harassed the land of Israel. They would attack and they would steal all of their crops. They would steal or they would destroy all of their hard work. And they were suffering because they were powerful and Israel was not. So God calls Gideon to be the leader to defeat the Midianites. And what was Gideon's flaw? He was a doubter. He wasn't sure if God called him or not, even though he heard his voice, right? So he does this little test with God. He says, God, if you have really called me to defeat the Midianites, you know what? I have this fleece of wool. Make this, you guys know this story? We need to read the Old Testament more. Let the dew of the morning land on this fleece only, and let the remaining land be dry. If that happens, I will know for sure. Because what happens in the morning when the dew settles? It settles everywhere, right? But he's asking God to make that happen only in a certain specific area on this fleece of wool only. And he said, God, then I will trust that it was you calling me for sure. And what do you know? God did that. And the Bible gives us an extra detail. When he wrung that fleece, there was a huge bowl of water that was collected from the dew. That was how much God has given the dew on that fleece. But he still was a doubter. He still wasn't fully given. So he says, all right, God, okay, I'm halfway there, but if you could this time do the reverse. If you have dew on the rest of the land and keep this fleece dry, then I will know for sure. Then I will rise up and I will defeat the Midianites. I will be the leader that you call me to be. I mean, God does that. Isn't that amazing? But the flaw was he was a doubter. He was insecure of his calling. So he now gathers the soldiers to fight against the Midianites. The Midianites were a large army. They had 135,000 strong. Okay, so that was a large army, and Gideon gathered 32,000. Okay, so you do the math. 135 versus 32. Okay, greatly outnumbered. But you know what? If God is with you, those odds are not so bad, right? 4-1 odds. Okay, we can battle. If one person kills 4 people, then we have a chance. But God says no. You have way too many, says God. So God says, Gideon, tell your people, if anyone is scared, tell them to go home. And guess how many leave? 22,000 leave. Leaving Gideon with only 10,000 men. So Gideon's like, okay, what's going on, God? All right, God, I thought you called me to defeat the Midianites, and now it has shrunk to 10,000. Okay, can we defeat with the 10,000? God says, no. You still have way too many. So what does God do? He tells them to go down to the stream and tell the soldiers to drink out of a stream. So just out of curiosity, if you were to drink out of a stream, how would you drink? Assuming that you don't have any utensils or cups or anything. Just out of curiosity, how would you drink out of a stream? Daniel, you're doing what? This? Is there any other way that we can drink out of the stream? You can go down, okay? Okay, so the majority of the people drank the other way that we thought we would drink. I guess the modern people would drink like this, but they put their mouths to the stream and they drank, and that was 9,700 of them. And only 300 of them drank like this. Okay, they got on their knees and drank out of their hand. And God says, all those who drank the stream out of their mouths to the water, send them home. That leaves Gideon with how many? Just 300. And then God said, you know what? Okay, I will give you special weapons. Okay, incredible weapons. Laser guns and automatic rifles. No, God says, no. You know what? I'll give you jars and a trumpet and a torch inside that jar. And then at this point, probably Gideon's like, okay, God, I've given up. I've given up being a soldier to you. There's no way we can defeat this army. But they do. Right? God says, sneak up on them at night, smash the jars to the ground, and blow the trumpet, and then see what I will do to them. And then when they do that, everybody in the camp, the Midianite camp, they were all startled and they were all scared, and it was at night and they were in shock, and they ended up killing one another. God caused them to kill one another, and that's how God brought them victory. All for what? Because God wanted them to know that it was God giving them the victory. God reduced. What happens when God reduces? Your odds against the Midianites just decline drastically, right? You're up against greater odds, but God wanted that to happen to show them that it was God bringing them the victory. So it was God's victory. 300 over 135,000 men. God used his flaw, but God worked in a mighty way because he had faith in what God believed, or what God has told him. Same with Barak. Barak was also another story of a man with a great flaw. He was a great general. He fought under Deborah, another prophetess, and a judge at the time. He was afraid. This man was afraid. He didn't want to fight alone if Deborah didn't go with him. But anyways, so I'm not going to give you all the detail, but he ended up going by himself, bringing victory unto the Lord, because despite of his fear, he trusted in the Lord and he fought. Who's the other person that he mentioned, the author of Hebrews mentioned? Samson. Are we all very familiar with the story of Samson? This man was also blessed by God, and yet he also had a great flaw. What was his great flaw? He has an issue with women. He has an issue with women and also with his temper. God blessed him with great, unparalleled strength. He was a Nazirite. He was not to drink any kind of alcoholic drink or eat anything unclean, nor cut his hair, nor have any contact with anything dead. God blessed him with mighty power. He would defeat 1,000 Philistines by himself. Not using any weapon, but with the jawbone of a donkey. Right? And then, at one point, he would escape the enemies by tearing down the city gates. It's not some door like that, but it's a heavy gate that he just pulled out, and then he escaped. Right? God used him because he had faith in God, but we know how his life ended. Right? It was a sad story. He was captured by the Philistines, and his strength was all taken away because he married this woman that he was not supposed to. He was taken away, and his eyes were all gouged out, and he was tortured. And then he asked God for final strength, one final time, that he would honor God with. And he destroys the building, bringing down 3,000 Philistines with him. Right? And then we know Jephthah and David. What was David's flaw? Right? He was the greatest king of all in the Israelites' history, but he was most notable for fighting who? He was fighting who? Goliath. Right? Another Philistine. He was a giant, one distinguished warrior, right? And his flaw was he was a young man. So again, his odds were stacked high against him. Right? Not only in numbers, but in strength. This time he was a young boy, but he fights against the warrior soldier of Goliath. And then when they're facing each other, this is what Goliath tells the Israelites. Am I a dog that you send me with sticks? Because he was a shepherd boy. He went to face Goliath with a stick. And then this is what David tells Goliath. I want us to read this together. I think this is the gutsiest verse ever in the Bible. Always gives me chills every time I read. 1 Samuel 17. Let's read together if you can. This is David yelling at Goliath. Let's read together. David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with the sword and with the spear, with the javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand. I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies to the host of the Philistines this day, to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth. And all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, For the battle is the Lord's, and He will give you into our hand. What a gutsy declaration. And then he takes down. Even though the odds were stacked against him, even though he had a major flaw, he was nothing but a young boy, a shepherd boy, not even a trained soldier. But they were all used by God, despite all their flaws, despite of all the odds stacked against them, because they dared in faith. They dared against the world, and they were able to do that because why? Because they had their unwavering faith in God. Even though the enemies were great in number, even though the enemies were great in power, they stood against them because they had faith not only in themselves, but in who God was and what He told them that they can do through Him. Over and over and over again, God showed them that the battle was never about them fighting the enemies, but it was always God delivering them through their little faith that they had in God. So I want to challenge you this morning to glorify God through your victories. It is the Lord's battle after all, right? It is all God's grace. The reason you're here this morning was not because of your alarm. It wasn't because of your parents. It was because of God's grace that He has led you to be here in this room, to hear the Word of God and to worship Him. And I love when sports leaders or great actors, when they're being awarded for their accomplishments, whenever they give God glory, it always blesses me. Right? Because they have succeeded. They have had their victories, and in that high platform, they were not ashamed to give God glory. They were not ashamed to mention God's name to the world. You glorify God through your victories. And you can dare against the world because God is on your side. But today's passage takes a sharp turn. Not only you ought to give God glory by daring against the world, by fighting against it, by seeing victory in God. By faith, you must also dare against the world by losing. Losing according to the world's standards. Let's read the rest of our passage. Hebrews 11, verses 35 through 38. Let's read. Ready, set, go. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release, so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with swords. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy. Wandering about in deserts and mountains, in dens and caves of the earth. The list that we saw earlier, Samuel, David, those are the people, although they were flawed, they tasted victory in God because of their faith. But also the same passage contains people who did not taste victory, even though they lived by faith. A lot of these were talking about many prophets. When Israel lost their land, okay, so fast forward a little bit. God grants them physical king because they demanded a king just like the neighboring countries. Starting with Saul and then David and Solomon and so forth. But in their sinfulness, we are all sinful. No matter how great a king, we all fall short of the glory of God. And they lose their country altogether because of their sin. And in that, what happens? They were tortured by neighboring countries again. And God raises prophets, one after another, to bring the people back to Himself. And in the process, many, many were tortured and killed. Some women received back their dead by resurrection. Who are we talking about? If you read 1 Kings and 2 Kings, Elijah raises the son of a widow, Zarephath. And Elisha, his apprentice, raises a son, a Shumanite woman in 2 Kings 4. But not only that, many prophets were tortured. Who do we know? Prophet Jeremiah was beaten, and he was put in stocks. He was imprisoned. And others like Elijah or Isaiah, the traditions say he was sawn in two. Can you imagine your body being cut in half? Because of your faith in God. Because you stood for what you have preached. Because you have stood for what God has told you was to be true. They dared against the world, and in the eyes of the world, they lost. And not only that, many other prophets dared, and they were tortured, mocked, and mistreated. And they were put to shame, and they were mocked. And they lived wandering about in in skins of sheep and goats. And they lived in deserts, mountains, dens, and caves. In the eyes of the world, they were losing their life. They were the losers of the life. They didn't have any house to live in. They didn't have nice things to enjoy. They were not going on vacations, taking on cruises. They gave their lives up, daring against the world, because they believed the word to be true, and they stood for it. Despite losing everything, they stood. And what does God call them? And yet, what does God regard them? How does God regard them? God calls them of whom the world is not worthy of. Is there any greater glory than that? Greater honor than that? God considering you, still the world is not worthy of you, despite of you living in dens and caves. Being mocked, being mistreated, because you have chosen me. But the sad news is this, my brothers and sisters, the sad part of all this story is that we are living to please the world. Instead of daring against the world, we're trying so hard to be like the world. Be accepted by their standards. Right? To be glorified by their values. To be made according to the world's standards. Instead of living to be considered worthy by God. We're trying all we can to be like the world. We study so hard. We get that degree. We get that job. All for what? I want to ask you, why are you pursuing all of that in the end? Is it just to better your life? To live a more comfortable life? To get a bigger, fatter paychecks? What are you truly living for is the question that the author of Hebrews is asking all of us. Look at all the heroes that have gone before us and look at your life. Let's follow their footsteps. Let's be like these men of faith, men and women of faith who have walked their days in faith. How concerned are you for the spiritual battle? How are you daring against the world? How are you choosing God in your victories but also in your losses, in your despairs? How are you choosing God in your darkest hours? So I want to put it in the very realistic and practical terms. Our spiritual battle, the battle that we don't see, happens like this, realistically, in our tax reports, in our exams at schools, tests, in our work ethics, in your relationships with other people, in your friendships, in the values that you hold to, and in your direction in your life. All of those are your battlefields. Are you compromising what God tells you what is true? Are you not holding His word with the integrity that you ought to? Are you cutting corners? Are you compromising with the world to make your life better? Are you putting worship as your primary priority? Prioritizing God and worship over all things? Are you honoring Christ with your choices? Even though we may look like we're losing. Even though the world may tell you, oh man, you're a loser if you go to church. Oh man, you're not so cool if you're not drinking. Or if you're not partying like the rest of us, if you're not doing this or that, if you're not living in a certain way, you're a loser, may say the world. But if you choose God over all, God will consider you. The world is not worthy of you, for you are worthy of me. You have chosen me. You have chosen to value me in your life, in your successes, but also in your death, in your failures. I want to end with this passage. Let's all read Philippians 1, verses 18 through 21. Let's make it our life verse. And let's declare these words to the Lord. Let's read. Ready, set, go. Yes, and I will rejoice. For I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance. As it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be at all ashamed, but that with full courage now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. For me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. God may grant us victory in life, but God may not. God may grant us losses and failures in death, but whether by life or by death, we choose to honor Christ, because that is our greatest joy and our greatest value.